Welcome to Health Reform 2.0, the only place on the internet for people with a curious mind and a desire for a better healthcare system. Here we take you on a journey of our current quagmire, tell you where it came from and why the government can't fix it. Along the way, we'll tell you some history, bust a few big myths, tell you a few stories, and give you an idea how we can work together and get the healthcare system we want. Let's get started. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Health Reform 2.0. We're the only podcast on the internet for people with a curious mind and a desire for a better healthcare system. Today, we're on episode 1.5, and we're going to talk about how physicians rose in power. Today, you get to see that I'm joined in real life, right next to, he's real, he's not an image, next to Tim Henning, my co-host, and we're actually in the same place and recording at the same time instead of miles apart, or in some cases, thousands of miles apart. And so, Tim, why don't you tell the audience what we're going to talk about today?
Hey, thanks, Tom, and thanks for having me over and setting up this studio. It sure is going to work out better, I think. So we'll test it out and see how it goes today. So before we start today, I'd like to give our audience a little bit of roadmap of where we're at in the series and how that matches up to the chapters in your book. We're into episode 1.5 today. This is really the recap of chapter 4 when we covered it 1.4. So we're kind of aligned somewhat to the chapters. We're going to be off by one episode, but we probably get through 1.8, and 1.8 will get us to current events, where we are today. And then we'll start getting into some of the things that are plaguing our system. We'll talk about waste, fraud, and abuse. And we'll talk about Obamacare for sure and what happened recently.
Wait, we're actually going to talk about Obamacare?
Well, I think we want to get some grounding in what that was all about because of the interesting history of how that thing got passed, and then how we got rid of it with the new budget that was approved and the, not budget, but the new spending bill, and the repeal of the individual mandate.
Well, it's definitely been taken apart a little bit at a time, and I think we'll talk about in the future. Everybody thinks that Obamacare is being destroyed. It was going to always destroy itself. So one of the things I think when we do get to that episode, we can talk about how Obamacare was really built to fail.
It was going to fail, and they knew it from the very beginning. They even admitted that. So we'll get into that later. We've got a little recap of the last episode. We talked about the muckrakers and Samuel Hopkins Adams, a big effect in the demise of the patent medicine business. The Red Claws, which netted that group about $20 million a year, I think we said.
Yep.
How nurses came to the rescue. We're going to talk more about nurses. A number of legislations that were passed, the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Act, and how women actually helped force those changes. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 forced the labeling of products.
Right. Keep
in mind, it was a labeling. It didn't say anything about controlling or taking the substance out. It's just letting people know what was in them.
Yep.
The Harrison Narcotics Act, and then the Volstead Act, which was the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, and prohibition. And that didn't work out so good either, did it, Tom?
Yeah, we went through the Volstead Act and we banned alcohol, and then the women pushed that. That was one of the issues that was part of their initiative. And the benefit of them pushing against temperance was it did clean up the drug issues. The downside is we've learned the lesson with the Volstead Act, I think, that we just can't ever ban people from using narcotics or using inebriating, to use that term, substances. They're going to do it. So we might as well figure out a way to let them do it and at least have some level of control.
Yeah, I have a whole series that we want to talk about on that. To get into this episode, the topic we're going to start with is this is a time when physicians rise in power.
Yep.
And I want to give the audience a little bit of a grounding in some statistics. In the late 1900s, the life expectancy was about 49.2 years old, which was considerably better than it was when we started this series.
Well, and remember, when my grandfather was born in 1872, the lifespan was between 42 and 45 years. And it was at that point around the 1870s when all this really, medicine started to shift and lifespan started to expand.
And it's amazing because if you took a look at the timeline, which I was working on yesterday, it seemed we were making a major progress with every 10 years. We were actually increasing the lifespan almost exactly a year per year.
Right.
Until we hit 2010.
Right.
And if you read the recent data, which we'll talk about in a minute, we haven't made a whole lot of gains in the last 5-6 years. In fact, it's going the other direction.
And there's potentially a couple of reasons for that. And one of the reasons is healthcare is getting more dangerous. And number two is the things we've been using to protect ourselves in healthcare, particularly the role of antibiotics and medications itself, have taken us out of natural selection. Right. And since we're no longer in natural selection, we're actually becoming weaker as a species. At the same time, the things in our environment that prey on us are getting much stronger. So you could have almost predicted this if you were actually paying attention to this data a number of years ago. Unfortunately, everybody wasn't focusing on us as a species and our robustness. So we're starting to see the effects of the things that have helped us gain years. Mother Nature, is the great equalizer, is starting to figure out more ways to get us to die at around 45, which is basically what we did for most of our existence.
That's true. And an article I saw today I thought was interesting. So the U.S. Army is determined that their basic training and AIT programs are no longer tough. Is that a surprise to you?
No.
Yeah.
No, not at all.
So the level of sophistication, the endurance, the physical attributes of today's soldiers are not what they were. And so they've now changed the program, I understand from this article today, to go back to where basically you and I were in 1970.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out, but there's no surprise there. So that, to me, it's always been, you've got to, whatever we need to do as a species, whether we wipe our hands with these gels,
antiseptic gels,
antiseptic gels, and the things we see, and you go into some of these hospitals and you can see the different what's the name of the infectious MRSA.
Yeah, well, that's one of them. It's C. diff, MRSA, flesh-eating Staphylococcus epidermis. There's 14 bad germs we can get right now, and none of those things are doing much to help.
Hospitals are a dangerous place.
Yep.
That's for sure.
They are.
But in the early 1900s, again, the life expectancy was about 49.2 years. By 1930, it was 59.2. So that was a significant gain.
Right.
Some of the reasons: indoor plumbing, major contribution, sanitation, a number of different vaccines were available at that point in time.
Right.
Electricity was invented. They started with the antiseptic practice, which I think was Listerine.
Joseph Lister. Mm-hmm.
And then the advent of ether we talked about, where we could do surgery. Expanded roles of nurses and orderlies was something that we talked about earlier. The invention of the air conditioner in 1902. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't sound like a significant event, but that's a very significant event.
It was a very big deal. It helped workers on the factory floor. It did improve health. It got people a little better environment to survive within in their homes. But the main reason air conditioning came about, we have to remember, was not for personal convenience.
That's right.
Air conditioning was created to extend the work days during the summertime, because during the summer, factories had to shut down in the heat of the day because most of their workers were passing out from heat stroke. So air conditioning originally was created so that factories could work 24/7 or work more during the day, actually, in that period of time.
Yeah, that's what I was reading that, and it doesn't surprise me because that's obviously the need to production. And of course, now look what we have today. We've got air conditioning everywhere, which is great. At the same time, the access to the automobile, I think that had a profound effect because you could actually get to a doctor. You didn't have to ride a horse for, Well, we have the home we have up in the mountains, up in gold country. It's interesting. Every one of those gold towns is exactly 30 miles apart. Mm-hmm. And it had to be, that's about the endurance of a horse.
Pretty much. It was a distance that you could travel on a horse in a day.
Yeah. So that's interesting because I remember being back in Illinois and we talked about, there was a heavy Amish contingent there when I lived there. And our emergency room, unfortunately, sometimes we'd have people come in their buggies with people that were severely hurt and weren't able, and they didn't get to care in a timely manner.
Right.
And the outcomes were not good in many cases.
Yep.
So I think the automobile gave us accessibility. At the same time, it led to other problems, which you go out on that road every day, you buckle up, that's the most dangerous thing you can do other than go into the hospital.
And I would argue with you that most Amish communities are probably much healthier than the other worlders that live all around them.
Yeah, I agree.
They tend to be closer to the land, closer to the infectious agents, and therefore their immune systems are stronger. They have good diets, and they also are very, very active as a people. So they work all day. They say heart to God, and work with their hands. All the things they did was a tribute to God, if they're woodworkers or if they're basket makers, and they tend to be very healthy.
So I think the Spartans had it down pretty good. They just take you when you're a very young child, throw you out in the wilderness, and if you survived, you were hardy enough to be a Spartan.
Yeah. Well, and you had a life expectancy of about 28 years old.
Not very long. Not very long.
Yeah, about 28, and you'd have been fine.
That was their society. It was a war society.
Yeah.
So between 1900 and 1930, hospitals grew from around 1,400 to 2,100. Today, last count that I checked, we have just around, it may not even be quite 6,100. I think it's consolidated.
Yep.
At one point, we got up to around 7,000, 7,500.
Right after the Hill-Burton Act in the 40s that really drove the stimulation of rural hospitals.
And we see the demise of the rural hospital occurring, which we'll get into when we talk about.
Well, Obamacare took out the Hill-Burton subsidies, so now they're on their own.
They're on their own. They're not doing well.
Yeah. We literally are going back to the 1890s in terms of our healthcare system.
When you actually look at the history and you look at the timetable, that's absolutely true. It's almost scary.
Yeah.
So even though we were growing to hospitals, the medical profession was still not very good. It wasn't that well, survival was still based on the daily physician visits, and it wasn't sophisticated. It was still under a lot of pressure. Mm-hmm. So once again, as always, entered the AMA, which we'll talk about probably forever. So we know how we talked before about they controlled the state licensing process, which also affected the insurance companies. Today is one of the reasons that you can't go across state lines because of what this established. So in 1910, the Carnegie Foundation, in conjunction with the AMA, funded a study. It was called the Flexner Report, I believe, led by Dr. Abraham Flexner. And it was really the nail in the coffin of the eclectic and homeopathic schools of medicine, because it severely limited the types of schools you could attend, and established the schools only for allopathic medicine.
Right.
So they asserted their authority and developed the creation of standards for hospitals and internships. That way they controlled who could be a doctor. And if you weren't in one of their dedicated and certified teaching institutions, you weren't going to get a medical license.
And remember, they did this state by state. They took over state licensures, which has created problems with us today. All the states license physicians independently instead of having a federal licensure, which is interesting because, you had the patent medicine men looking to have a federal authority to oversee patents and trademarks that didn't really exist at the beginning of the country. But the physicians went the other way, and they went state by state initially and took over licensure. So now all states were licensing doctors directly, which has created the problem we have today. We don't have a federal licensure. And Flexner, because the allopathic physicians were trying to preserve their practice, the Flexner report went out and basically declared that all the other schools, homeopathic, eclectic, and even osteopathic, although osteopathic has been able to hang on and survive.
They have survived.
He went out and basically said none of these things work. You have to go for, quote, scientific medicine, and the only kind of medicine that is scientific medicine is allopathic medicine. And remember, this is in the 1890s, early 1900s, and today, only about 25% of the procedures doctors do still have a basis in science. So back then, it wasn't close to 25%, but it's taken us, a long, long time to get to the point where we actually have 25% with a basis in science for practice.
Yeah, kind of scary. So in 1927, the AMA published the first list of hospitals that were approved for residency training. So they gained all but complete control of the practice of medicine in the United States.
And hospitals.
So I also want to bring up one point we'll talk about at some point, is the CME credit program, which you're quite familiar with. I know I am. And again, it continues to be a way of just controlling the continuing education, which I think continuing education we have to have. It's excellent. But I witness how it's being abused and how the tricks are made to go to these things, do it, and not participate in any of it. So we will talk about that.
Well, one other point on the control of the hospital. The doctors finally got control of hospitals, and the pivot point was prior to about 1909. Physicians weren't allowed to charge for services in hospitals. We said this before. Only doctors could.
Right.
It was 1909 when it finally became okay for a physician to charge for services in a hospital. And that was a testament to the power of the AMA that really neutered hospitals, neutered the role of doctors, and put allopathic physicians on the path to becoming the only approved medication therapy that was there had to be based on allopathic science. And that was where the Flexner report, that was funded by Carnegie and Mellon, as we said, and others. And it was the Flexner report that drove the last nail in the coffin and really destroyed the other practices of medicine, the other schools of medicine, the only exception being osteopathic. And you can look around today and count on your hand the number of osteopaths that are out there. And almost all of them have actually learned osteopathy in a licensed school of allopathic medicine.
Were there any other things that the AMA asserted at this period of time? Was this pretty much it? Because we're going to talk about what really happened to them in the introduction of Medicare. And of course, we know that the subscriptions to the AMA by physicians has dropped almost 50%, maybe even more lately, and we'll get into that later.
Exactly. It's lost its power, not its voice.
Exactly. So we went from the pharmaceuticals, to medicine men, and we talked a little bit about, in the last episode, ethical pharmaceuticals compared to what the medicine men were offering and so forth. Yeah, most of our current drug companies, many of them have beginnings in the patent medicine game. We talked about that in the last episode.
Right.
Thought we might want to just recap a few of those to bring people up to speed because they still exist today.
They do. And, there's companies around. We talked in the last episode about a series of companies. Let's bring up a couple of them. We had Bristol Myers Squibb exists today. It started as two companies, Bristol Myers on one side and Squibb on the other. Today, it's about a $14 billion company. It's got 28,000 employees. But Bristol Myers started in 1887. There was two gentlemen, William Bristol and John Myers, and they purchased the Clinton, oddly enough, wasn't Bill Clinton's company, but it was the Clinton Pharmaceutical Company, and they produced patent medicine at that time called Sal Hepatica. That was something, once again, that existed in my house as a kid. My father talked about Sal Hepatica quite a bit, and that product hit the market in 1900, and it was called the Poor Man's Spa. And what was Sal Hepatica? Sal Hepatica was nothing more than a laxative. And it went on to show that even in 1900, the treatments that we were providing to people and still do today were based on the four humors that Gale talked about at 300 BC. One of the four humors is black bile. We have a number of terms we use for black bile today. I won't repeat any of them, but Sal Hepatica was one of the treatments that existed for quite a while, up until the 40s and 50s, and that was one of the Bristol Myers Company products. They merged with the Squibb Company, and that was E.R. Squibb, who was a Navy medic, set up his own laboratory about the same time that they formed in Brooklyn, New York. By 1859, he had 38 different prescriptions, preparations that he had in the marketplace. By 1883, he had 324 different products in the marketplace, and he was selling products all over the world. Most of his products, as we showed you in a pamphlet before, if you were watching the video of one of the last things, were based on cannabis. Cannabis was a very popular. There was bulk cannabis that you could smoke or chew. There was extract of cannabis powder that people used as a snuff. Women used it for menstrual problems, and a number of other cannabis derivatives, cannabis oil, etc. Another company we spoke about was Warner Lambert, and we spoke about they developed Listerine in 1897. It was named after Joseph Lister, who revolutionized surgical practice with his book on antiseptic practice. Prior to Joseph Lister, the surgical mortality rate was about 60%. Even from having things like getting a wart removed or those kind of things, the mortality rate was high due to infection. After Lister came out with his book, the mortality rate went down to 4%. So that's a huge shift. And surgery could be done and you didn't die. And of course, ether came along and made it painless. But Listerine started as a surgical antiseptic. It didn't work very well there. Then for a short period of time, it was put in as a floor cleaner, and then it was a cure for gonorrhea. So what Listerine is a mixture of menthol, thymol, and methyl salicylate in a 21.6% solution of alcohol. They tried it as all these things, including the cure for gonorrhea, but they really came into their own, and dentists began using that when they were doing oral surgery. But in 1920, they actually released it as a cure for the dreaded disease halitosis. It became an over-the-counter mouthwash, and once they found a disease, that became a big deal. And the main thing that Warner Lambert should be remembered for was creating the concept of disease shopping, where you came up with a product and had to go find a disease that it cured. And in this case, they found an esoteric reference to an old word, halitosis, for bad breath. And they proceeded to go out and market this product as the cure for bad breath and attribute all kinds of problems that could happen if you had bad breath in your life. We have a modern example of that, which is Viagra, which is a cure for erectile dysfunction. And it doesn't mean that erectile dysfunction isn't a disease that happens and doesn't affect a few people. It does. It affects a few people. But we now have people using Viagra that don't have erectile dysfunction. They want erectile superfunction. So most of the sale of Viagra today is not to people that really have erectile dysfunction. They just want to perform above and beyond the call of duty.
So let's go back to that for a minute. You mentioned in the previous discussion about the Clinton company. Mm-hmm. If that would have been really Bill Clinton's company, I think he'd be all over that Viagra, wouldn't you think?
They'd have been producing Viagra, I could tell you right now.
It'd be great.
It would.
And going back to Listerine, so it makes a great floor cleaner. I know because the dog threw up yesterday on the floor.
Yeah.
I went and got some Listerine just to test it. Worked pretty
good. You're learning something from these episodes.
Right.
People, you need to watch these episodes because you'll learn how to use most of your day-to-day products in your house for medical applications, and you'll learn how to use some of your medical applications for their original day-to-day product roots.
I just want to know how Listerine, I just want to know the application of Listerine to cure gonorrhea. Now this visual is just not a good one for me.
Well, it was using a cannula, and you know what a cannula is. Yeah. And for people that don't know, a cannula is a perforated tube that you can insert into a body orifice or cavity and use it to perfuse that cavity, push a liquid, or in some cases a gel, into that body cavity. And in this case, they used a cannula and inserted it in the male organ, down the tube, and then flushed it with this great product, Listerine. If you want to get an idea of what that was like, next time you have a small cut, just pour a little Listerine in it and see how long that lasts.
I don't even like to use it as a mouthwash because it burns my mouth.
It is a very caustic product.
The vision of this is just mind-boggling to me. I want to put that on my mind right now because
I got some Listerine. I could probably find a cannula if you want.
We're not interested.
Okay, good.
We're gonna be good.
All right. Well, another company that's around today that was there, and it's a huge company today, is called Pfizer. And Pfizer started in 1849, and it was one of today's pharmaceutical companies. But in that period of time, it really never sold patent medicines. It wasn't a patent medicine maker in that day like others. But what they have purged from their history is any tie to the patent medicine makers of the day. And where Pfizer started was pioneering the production of citric acid, selling iodine, boric acid, and tantaric acid, which were all used in many of the patent medicine nostrums of the day. That's where Pfizer got its start. Of course, years later, they bought Warner Lambert, and as they were moving forward into the world of the so-called ethical pharmaceuticals, they were buying up a number and have bought up a number of those early patent medicine makers. Another one we spoke about was Miles Laboratories, who had their first product, the compound extract of tomato, which we call ketchup today. They had a product called Nervine. They have a product that many of us remember, still in the market today, called Alka-Seltzer. Alka-Seltzer was the follow-on product of Nervine. Nervine ended up, they found out, had an actual dangerous chemical in it that made people ill and caused real problems. They replaced that with a seltzer, a product that when you put it in water would fizz and it would go into solution that way. So they got rid of the core of Nervine. But that's where it came from. But Miles was one of the first companies to transition from patent medicines into the so-called ethical pharmaceuticals, and they're still around today with a number of products like Alka-Seltzer, although Miles Laboratories now is owned by somebody else. I forget who owns it.
Well, those are good points about how these companies have developed and producing some good products, starting in a different direction years ago. And I think it's a great history lesson. It kind of brings to light to me a little bit about how these things began and where they're going.
Yep.
You did bring up one point, and that is the development of things and then go finding a disease to fit those things.
Yep, disease shopping.
We do the same thing in the medical device industry. Mm-hmm. We come up with devices all the time that really did not have any disease-associated or procedure-associated type of a beginning. We just developed it, and then we go try to figure out a way to find a disease that can fit into the use of that device. Yeah, it still goes on all the time.
Why not? We've got a product we can sell for $1 million or $2 million a pop. And if we just put it out there to replace the X-ray for broken bones and things, it's not going to, no one's going to be able to afford it because they can't get paid enough to do it. So we've got to come up with mechanisms to use these more and more complicated visualization systems, which really are necessary for a very small set of diseases. But we've got to find a way to get them used by all these diseases, because if they're not, then no one can afford to buy them just for the few that they are really good for.
Which is a good segue into our next session here, because I'm going to talk about malpractice. Mm-hmm. And before we go into that, a couple of points I want to make. I did a lot of research and digging. I couldn't find a lot on any type of malpractice. Maybe you found more, obviously, in your research, but it doesn't seem to be prevalent. Before we go to that, so I want to make a couple points. If you read Maggie Meyer's book on money-driven medicine, she has a chapter devoted to malpractice, and in that, the conclusion is, even today, and this was dated about 5 years ago, that malpractice was still only contributing 5 to 8% to the healthcare dollars. Mm-hmm. But that's just what's paid to lawyers. So that does not count what's practiced in defensive medicine.
Well, defensive medicine is a big issue, because if you look at a healthcare dollar and you determine where the cost goes, where the waste goes, 60% of every healthcare dollar is cost in fraud and abuse, which is 20 cents on the dollar, and then duplicated services or unnecessary services, which is 40 cents of the dollar. And if you talk to people, the biggest excuse you now hear for the duplicated unnecessary services is defensive medicine. Well, in some cases that's true. It does play a role, but remember, doctors get paid to do things. And one of the reasons they do things is to get paid to do them. So when you have imaging systems or diagnostic systems that are relatively low risk to a patient, but also become procedures that can be billed for in healthcare, we shouldn't just blame it on the doctor. You've got doctors and hospitals and other kind of providers as well. Those become things doctors routinely will start to do because they increase the bill, increase their income. And as we've reduced reimbursement rates for individual procedures, as we've gone after trying to lower the cost of care, the industry has found a way to just provide more of it.
That's true. And so, give you an example. I was up at Mark Twain Hospital. Radiologist there was a very good friend of mine. I could walk in there anytime and happened to be meeting with him. This was a number of years ago. And was in his office and on the PACS, which is where you get the representation of the images you're reviewing. There was clearly a CT scan of a child, a small child. And I'm looking at the thing, and I look at him, and he looks at me, and he shakes his head. He goes, "Yeah, you see that too, don't you?" And I said, You're radiating that kid from the head to the toe." He said, "Yeah, the kid fell off the monkey bars on the playground, so the ER doc is having me do scans, and when he doesn't find anything, he has me go back and rescan him again." I said, "You just put a ton of dose into that kid's orbits." He goes, "Yeah, I know, but I got to do what the ER guy tells me."
Right.
And so we've lost the connection to, let's do a clinical evaluation, right? Your pupils are dilating properly. You're not puking up. You don't have a headache. I know how many times I fell off the monkey bars.
Right.
Look what happened to me.
Right.
Right. Well, I digress.
You might be a bad example. Me too.
Example.
Yeah, I've been spending time with our healthcare system. I had to have a basal cell carcinoma taken off my nose, which is one of the reasons I have this Band-Aid on. And in the old days, I would have gone in and gotten that cut out and gotten a scar. And I might not have liked the scar personally. I don't really care. I'm not some movie star. But my dermatologist, who normally has done this procedure for me, couldn't do it because the insurance company wouldn't let him. So now I have to go for Mohs surgery. And believe me, I'm not complaining about the Mohs surgeons. They did a wonderful job. I've had 2 or 3 things removed, and there's been no scarring. But it took 6 hours for me to get one cancer cut off my nose. I had another one cut off by my derm that he could do, and he cut that off. I was in and out in 15 minutes. This was going to cost a couple $100. This is going to cost tens of thousands or maybe multiple thousands. But we're moving in a direction where these things are coming partly because of liability, partly because insurance companies don't want to have the argument with the patient, and partly because we build a legal system that figures that everybody that's out there that has anything bad happen is no longer a victim, but it's an opportunity to go get free money. So, we've created this environment ourselves. And if you go back to the early days, you asked about malpractice. You go back to the early days, they didn't have insurance for physicians. They didn't have liability insurance in the days we're talking about. That came later. But they were starting to have patients complain and bring up lawsuits and have to defend themselves in lawsuits. So if you go to 1919 and you look at Medical World magazine, which was a big magazine of the day, you'll find a quote that's in there where they had gone out to doctors because this liability was becoming a big issue. And they went out to doctors and they asked the question, how do you protect yourselves from liability? And they got this form that they published that they received from a physician. I don't remember the guy's name. And if you are a video watcher, if you watch our videos, we will put this form up there. I'll try to remember to put this form in the blog post when we put it up, if you go to the blog to listen to the audio podcast. But it was basically a form that says, I'm signing up now, and and Tom Loker, you're going to have me do the surgery to remove this cancer from your nose. And you're understanding that you're not going to be able to sue me for anything. It was literally a form that sat on a piece of paper this big, about a 3x5 card. In fact, if you read in this Medical World magazine, they actually give full instructions on doctors, including a form that they can reproduce and tear out of a book. So they could tear out the form, have the patient sign it, and it's basically releasing the surgeon from any claims or damages that could happen based on them doing a surgical procedure. And it worked really, really well. So I was looking at something today. I had to sign a piece of paper relative to moving some money from one account over to my retirement account. And I'm transferring over a very small amount of money, less than $10,000. I had to sign 6 papers. And you go buy a car today, and you've got about 230 pages of a document to buy a car. You buy a house, you have 200 or 300 pages to buy a house. And why is that? Because we've allowed our legal profession to go out and convince all of us that we're professional victims. And many people go out now today and pray to be a victim. Because if you're a victim, you've got a license to go make money. So unfortunately for all of us, this has been the trend line. That's how we got to malpractice today. But back in 1920, they found a pragmatic way to solve for it and said, if you want to buy a car from me, I'm going to sell it for you, and you get to buy it. And you're signing right here that says that no matter what happens to you with that car, it's on you, buddy.
Yeah, it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah. Well, it should, but it doesn't.
It doesn't. See, it's a good thing it wasn't $10,000. They would have had to contact the IRS. So
exactly.
That's another story.
Exactly.
Yeah, so malpractice is in many different forms. You know how much a OBGYN pays in malpractice insurance in the state of Arizona today?
I have no idea.
$125,000 a year.
Yeah, it's malpractice is one of the single biggest costs for a physician in their practice. It basically is more for malpractice insurance than they would pay a PA to work for them. The average salary for a physician's assistant is somewhere around $118,000 to $120,000. So they're paying more than they pay the PA to do this just to protect themselves from liability.
Well, sure they do. Yeah, they have to do all the charting and everything else. And now we'll talk about MACRA and a few of these other things that are going to come into play. It's going to put much more burden, and it's not just burden on time. Physicians that aren't in the corporate practice of medicine have to buy more IT support. They have to buy more things to keep track of this stuff, and most of them really don't know how to do it anyway, so they have to hire more consultants, and the list just goes on and on.
Yep.
So we're going to bring this episode this next session to a conclusion with probably the last thing we'll talk about on the patent medicine then. And this is entitled The Life and Death of the Patent Medicine King. So let's look back to Morristown, New York, and the story of William Comstock and the Comstock patent medicine business. One of the major patent medicine companies of this period, if not the number one.
Oh, yeah. Well, he was the longest, and if you add it all up, probably the most successful patent medicine man of all time, with the exception of Coca-Cola.
Right.
But the difference is Coke got out of patent medicines and started selling soft drinks and consumer products. Comstock stuck to his guns and continued to sell nothing more than pure patent medicines all the way up to the 1960s.
Sure did. We'll have it when they shipped the last, which was not that long ago.
No.
So back to Morristown. It's a quiet little village. I've never been there. I don't know much about New York.
I have, and it's a beautiful little village right on the river there. It's gorgeous.
Which is important to the story. So it's only 280 miles from New York City. And he relocated there from New York City.
Right.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was friends or in proximity of the manufacturer of Lee's bilious pills,
yes.
if I'm not mistaken in that case. So this Morristown, because of the river and its proximity to Canada, was ideal for his business. You want to explain why that was such an ideal location for him?
Well, it was ideal for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was close to a river, and the river gave him the ability to ship stuff relatively cheaply. There was a rail line that went up close there, so he could put a little tail on the rail line and pull it right up to his factory. It gave him the easy way to ship medication. But it was the most strategically important because right across the river was Canada. And he could split his manufacturing and put manufacturing in Canada and put it over there, and he could play games with taxes, play games with all kinds of things to lower his cost. And he, in effect, went into a sleepy little village and consumed the town with a factory, became the biggest employer. Everybody worked for Comstock and really ended up with an ideal little situation there.
It looked like the ideal location for him. And I think that with this improved transportation, the wider circulation of newspapers, and we've talked about that a lot,
right?
Periodicals, cheaper and better bottles,
right?
Enabled them to really expand their distribution. And there was no real enforcement by the federal drug laws.
Right.
And so that helped him to build his business.
And not only was there no enforcement of the federal drug laws, but he could manufacture them in Canada, and they weren't applicable. The federal drug laws did not apply to the product that he shipped over from Canada, even though it came from a Comstock factory.
So in your book, you reference a book by Robert Shaw, which I think you did your research on. I tried to find it. I didn't have time to really pull it up on Audible.
Google Books.
I was going to do
Google Books. It's free.
I was going to do it on Audible because I got a lot of driving coming up. But so his book, The History of the Comstock Patent Medicine Business, and Dr. Moore's Indian Root Pills. So you want to tell us the rest of the story?
Yeah. Dr. Morse Indian root pills. It was the beginning of the Comstock medicine, and this was like pure snake oil. It wasn't an elixir as in liquid, they were pills. And in various forms, the Indian root pill story is just a masterful approach to the sales of patent medicines. They really didn't do anything. He manufactured the story of the Indian root pill and the little Indian woman that had helped, and there was this long story that went with it. So every time he would sell these Indian root pills to somebody, they got this story book that came with it, this little pamphlet that told the story of how Indian root pills began. And the other thing that was really noticed with or key to what Comstock did is he took the little pamphlets and started to expand them into what we now call almanacs today. And in the last video episode that we did, again, if you're listening to this on audio, we put a lot of meat into the video to bring in some historical pictures of things to help give you more information. But there's a number of almanacs that came out that were really driven by the patent medicine men. They created the newspapers as sell sheets. In fact, there was a newspaper that derived out of the Comstock business, little pamphlets. But the main thing he did was start to create almanacs that told the story of all the medicines he had, and Indian root pills were just one of them. It was one of the best marketing campaigns you've ever seen. And like I say, the thing lasted all the way up to
a long
1964.
Time.
They were still shipping Indian root pills in 1964 to McKesson.
I'm not surprised. And now you did better. I was going to ask you how it would be. Okay, where'd you get the word Indian and root pills? And now I kind of get it. The pamphlet explains it.
Yeah.
I remember almanacs, right? You can still go buy the Farmer's Almanac. My parents used to have these almanacs. But what I didn't realize that there were also these wrappers that they used to wrap produce or whatever, and they advertised on those.
Oh, yeah.
And so they really leveraged the newspapers of the era. They got these almanacs now that are out there.
Yep.
They were taking advantage of everything they could to promote these products. Can you imagine what it would have been like today with our media and the internet?
Well, it is like that today.
It is that way.
It hasn't changed. And we still have disease shopping. We talked about Viagra. We talked in the last episode about a deadly product called Lash Lure that blinded women that were using this to dye their eyelashes black or darker. And we have people today that are going and taking medications that have significant side effects that help them grow longer lashes. We are ignoring the side effects that we spent years and years trying to drive out of the patent medicine industry, because today we're becoming immune because every ad we have says, we're going to cure all the things that are wrong with you. And by the way, here's this list of 5 minutes that an announcer is going to say exceedingly fast in really small type down at the bottom of the screen. And one of those may be death. But it is with us today. It's on the internet. It's on television. It's still in the newspapers. The same thing that patent medicine people were doing to sell drugs, we're now doing today. But the difference is now we're saying, now, Tim, make sure you ask your doctor for this.
Well, sure. And that's a disclaimer. But let's go a little bit more deeper than that, because there's the patent medicines and there's the things that we know that we can get and we have disclaimers on, and we're fairly well aware of it because you can't get away from it. You've got the 2 seconds of ad and 20 seconds of disclaimers and the bad things this thing's going to do to you. But let's do one more step further. The examples of what we advertise that don't require those kind of things. My son's a big weightlifter. He's a big fitness creator, and he comes to visit and he orders this stuff. And this stuff shows up, this stuff called black mocha, or I don't know what the heck stuff is. And this powder stuff you throw in there. Mm-hmm. And I said, why don't you just eat a steak or something, And so I look at these. I don't know if they're doing any good or not. I'm not a big vitamin person. I just try to eat the right things. I don't take many vitamins. I don't take any vitamins, actually. But with our advertising today on the internet, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff so you can get the energy drinks. You get the 1 hour thing or the Red Bull, which I believe is mostly caffeine.
Yeah, they're high doses of caffeine that can cause all kinds of problems.
So if we're really trying to stop addiction, we would close every Starbucks there is.
Exactly. Caffeine is one of the most addictive substances, and nicotine. We went after the tobacco industry because of nicotine. The problem with the tobacco industry is the Surgeon General put out a report that said that smoking cigarettes leads to lung cancer. And there is ties between smoking and lung cancer. And there's ties between a number of things and different diseases you can have. But overall, the problem with all of the ties is the way you do those, and I'm not arguing they're not valid ties, but I want to use this as an example to illustrate a point. They find the tie by saying, we looked at all the people that had lung cancer, and we looked at the number of people that were smokers, and a huge number of people that were smokers are now people that have lung cancer. Well, that can be a valid statistic. It could be very valid. Let's say 63% of the people that smoke cigarettes are the population that has lung cancer. That meant that, a large percentage of people never smoked a cigarette and still got lung cancer, but of the people that smoke cigarettes, a good chunk of them got them. I will tell you that there is the worst, from that measure, the worst product you can have is this, water. Not the plastic bottle, just water. Why? Because I will guarantee you 100% of every person that got cancer drank water.
Good point.
So it's not saying that these things are not valid. They are. It's saying that the effect of their validity by the time it gets to public marketing and pushed out becomes a big issue. You and I have worked in the breast cancer area and screening ultrasound systems. And if you look at breast cancer, there's been multiple people trying to make ties between the evidence of a cancer and certain activities that people did, smoking, environmental, all these other things. Then they came up with this concept of the BRCA gene, BRCA1 and BRCA2. And that became, if you had the BRCA gene, it increased your likelihood of having cancer. It does, but it increases it by 5%. So we have to recognize that all this stuff goes on, and it all does have meaning. But for us as a public, we believe a myth that because this is there, I now have to do this because that's really going to be a problem. And the reality is it's not that cut and dried.
No, it never is. And you're going to see more of this genomic stuff coming up, which we've been talking about molecular imaging, monoclonal antibodies, all the way back to the 1940s, I think. We've just not been able to figure out how to get the right tracers and the right pieces to the parts. I've seen genomics work to some extent, but it prolongs life. It doesn't really cure anything. Mm-hmm. Because of the fact of the matter is people think that there's going to be a cure for cancer. I think that's a problem.
Yep.
So it'll show up at that point.
Yep.
So let's carry on with our good patent medicine company, Comstock Company. And let's pick it up with the Great Female Medicine. What was that?
Well, they had a series of products. They had the Great Female Medicine, which was just another one of the products that they put out there that was targeting at females to help them with menstrual cramps or with other things that build up vigor and things like that. They had Dr. Howard's Blood Builder. They had a number of products that came out that were mostly sold through their pamphlets and through their almanacs. But ultimately, these products carried Dr. Comstock forward proudly as one of the last patent medicine men. And as we said earlier, he continued to thrive and sell these products into the marketplace. And it was really March 31st, 1960, when Dr. Morse Indian root pills, the last shipment left the building on April 11th of that year. The factory closed its doors. And that was really the end of Comstock. And it was an interesting story. It's interesting in a lot of ways. And the impact of that company and companies like Patent Medicine Men on our current medical system and our current ideas about healthcare can't be underestimated. Most of the myths that we believe about the power of nostrums and drugs today and all these different things that are sold by pharmaceutical companies, we have this belief that they're highly effective. And most of that comes back to how patent medicine men started to sell these things in their day and age, and our societal belief that these things innately work, when in many cases they don't work much more than 50 or 60% of the time.
Correct. So that was the end of it. Probably won't talk too much more about patent medicines going forward, but they do morph in some ways into what we have today. We have consumer products, drinks, candies, confections, and some did morph into the ethical pharmaceutical companies.
Yep.
So let's wrap it up here and talk about some of the advancements in this period, 1900 and 1930. There were quite a few, actually.
Yep.
Smallpox vaccine was developed.
There was.
We figured out the 4 blood groups, the ABO typing, which was great because it helped us with transfusions and led to plasma and all those type of things.
Right.
The electrocardiograph, which we mentioned before, that's pretty good period of time for having that particular. I was surprised. I thought that was going to be developed at a later date, but I'm surprised it was developed in this period of time.
Iodine got added to salt.
Insulin to treat diabetes.
Right.
The interesting thing is 1917, the American Pharmaceutical Association proposed that these groups get together, proprietary association, work with one another, and that laid the groundwork to what we know today as a powerhouse of the APHA.
Right.
The insulin, diphtheria vaccine, whooping cough vaccine, and the 1928 by discovery of the penicillin by Alexander Fleming.
Yep.
That was a major milestone. I remember that. A major deal, especially in the battlefield.
Yep.
Buffered aspirin was developed at this point in time.
And for people that don't know, because a lot of people don't even take aspirin anymore, aspirin is a chemical. It's called sodium salicylate, and it has the negative side effect of it can cause ulcers and bleeding in a stomach. Buffering aspirin was a mechanism that allowed you to take aspirin and offset the increased acid production that caused that damage to the stomach lining. Excedrin, which was a competitive product to aspirin, didn't have that side effect. So
I don't even take aspirin anymore. I just not. So on to, that'll wrap it up for today. I was going to give a little introduction to episode 1.6. That'll be our next recording, hopefully soon. And that's titled The New Depression, New Deal, and New War. I found this to be interesting because I didn't really study this much when I was younger to go through this period of time. And, what the Depression did, what FDR did. Not a big FDR fan, but he did some things probably because of what he had to do. The New Deal, and of course, we enter into World War II, come out of it in pretty good shape. We'll talk about that.
We learned some things about battlefield medicine that have translated over into what we do in emergency rooms today.
It's amazing because when I look at the time levels, every time I go through a period of time tied back to your book, there's always a war somewhere in between there.
Oh, yeah. Well, wars were big. Wars were big advantages to the U.S. Without wars, we would have been bankrupt shortly after founding. It gave us the ability to increase the economy without being tied to a standard, and it gave us the ability to sell a lot of products to people that were battling.
Yeah, which I'm doing the research on now, because when I got to the section, it'll be our last episode before we talk about today, you've got many pages dedicated to the gold standard, to our dollar, the floating markets. I need to dig into that a little bit more. That'll be a good education for me because I never really studied that. But now as I study it, you can get a sense of the what is going on here.
Yeah, the problem, and as we'll talk about, the problem in our economy today when it comes to healthcare is healthcare has an inordinate impact on our economy, primarily because we've structured our economy to really start to pay for things like healthcare. And the second part of the problem is the economy we've built has been completely false. It's false on a number of fronts. We can't really believe the numbers we talk about. And the second side of the equation is we've built an economy that actually is stimulating the growth of the cost in the economy every time we do a transaction because the nature of the way we've thought was a good idea to pay for stuff. So all of those things are coming. The other point during this period we're going to talk about coming up is it'll be the time we talk about the birthplace of Kaiser.
That's right.
And the Hill-Burton Act and the growth of hospitals across the United States and rural communities and the impact positively and negatively that had. And we're trying to get a good friend of mine, Henry Kaiser, who is the grandson of Henry J. Henry Kaiser will join us on one of the episodes where we're going to talk about Kaiser and tell you a little bit about his family history and what he remembers of Kaiser Permanente and his grandfather. And Kaiser's a very interesting story. He was an interesting man who some people vilified and others have idealized. And when you really start to understand his story, you realize he was basically another good human being who did some very good things. And you'd be surprised to find out why he did them. They weren't for the reasons you think.
Correct. So I'm anxious to talk about that. It's a great story. So I want to thank you for having me over. I kind of like this setup, actually.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. I like this. It's a little easier. Hopefully it'll make it easier to edit these videos.
And so I'm looking forward to it. I'm headed up to the mountains, to the mountain house for 2 weeks. So we'll record from up there. I'll have the big ponderosa pines behind me, and we'll head out to Silver Lake and we'll do some scenery out there. So we'll record
with a battery. You can sit up on Silver Lake, and you can be, if you got Wi-Fi, you can be able to communicate with me right there.
Absolutely. So we'll be recording from, at least from my vantage point, in the wilderness.
I'm going to start calling you Waldo because I'm never sure where you are.
It's a good point. Most people don't know. I don't even know where I'm at half the time. Yeah. But thank you so much for the time today. Thanks to the audience for listening. Hope you're finding this to be informative and getting a few chuckles out of it as well.
All right. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye.